I feel like reformer is such an active title for a piece of apparatus, right? It's not just a piece that you lie down on. It's something that is meant to reform you. And by reforming yourself, you then get to show up as a better human being in the bigger context of the world. And I think that's sort of the grandiose language that Joseph Pilates attached to his work. So in a lot of ways, I really applaud him for finding that name for this piece of apparatus, because it was the centerpiece of his work and of his studio, really, right through the end of his life. Universal then means, I think it can take on a couple of different meanings. And I think in his idea of reforming the world and being a reformer for the world, because he believed that practicing his work can change the world, not just people's bodies, their well-being, but it changes the fabric of the society, really, for people to be in their bodies and to be in control over their bodies. So I think universal really had that literal meaning of universally reforming the planet and beyond. But I think also, if you go more granular, universal reformer, if you compare the reformer to any other piece of apparatus, which often are more pick and choose, right? You pick your cherries from different pieces of apparatus to deal with, say, a specific condition, problem, something that hasn't clicked yet. You take that person to the barrel, the Cadillac, put a spring on it. Whereas the reformer was this universal piece that teaches your body in this sequence that is globally approaching the body. This concept of whole body health comes back, this concept of using your body fully at all times. And I think the universal reformer represents that so beautifully, because if you run through any part of that sequence, however you lay it out, you are going to use your body in a very full, universal, global way. And I think that's what it means to me. I think that's what I read in his take on, describing his work and trying to market it during his time. So that to me is what the universal reformer stands for, this idea of reforming the universe. It's cheesy as it sounds.
No. I mean, there are literally so many things that I take away from classes and workshops with you that are unrelated to the actual physical exercises of Pilates, which is why I was so keen to talk to you, because it's all the little nuggets of information, a little drip feed things, and think, what did he just say there? That's what I love about your workshops. It's just like, just learn something. And for me, one of the things that we learned on that session, that workshop, was how you were talking about the reformer being the teaching assistant for themselves and for us. Now we've got so many places that do teach group reformer classes, and they've got dynamic reformer classes and whatever people call them. What's the point of the teaching assistant aspect? And do you still have that if you've got being led in many people in a group?
Yeah, I think honestly, in my own evolution since that workshop, which was 2015, does that sound right to you?
Maybe, yeah, maybe even a fraction before, yeah.
Maybe even before. It's a while back. I feel like today I would go as far as saying that the reformer is the teacher. And we are the guides in the process. But I believe, and that was even in the teaching assistant analogy, was my belief, and it still holds true to today. I believe that this apparatus was put together to inform and reform you in a very active way. It is not because somebody's standing by your side and telling you what to do and what to think and what to engage and what not to engage, and too much this, too little that, etc. It's the doing, it's the being on the reformer and being in sync with the apparatus, feeling the resistance, feeling the shoulder blocks against you, constantly being aware of how you relate to the piece you're on. That's what teaches you. And then doing it often, that's what teaches you. And what we as teachers then add to the experience is clarity, safety, as well as making decisions for those that cannot yet make good decisions for themselves. And I think really that's, in a nutshell, our role as a teacher. It's not to teach the choreography of an exercise. That happens once, but after you've taught footwork once, you don't have to teach it ever again. You just stand by and you let the reformer do the teaching while you do the guiding, if that makes any sense. So how does that translate to group classes? I think I believe I may be quoting Jay Grimes here, or I may be misquoting Jay Grimes here. So don't take my word for it. But I believe that he said something along the lines of, you can't teach Pilates. You can only offer it to people. And that quote, I believe it was him, always stuck with me. And I think it's true in the group class context as well. We often as teachers think it's our job to make sure that everybody does Pilates correctly, but I believe our job really is to offer an environment where they can practice Pilates. And those two things are kind of different. And so I'm personally not the kind of person who teaches, 16 people on a reformer in A to Z class, everybody synchronized kind of way. And that's a personal choice. I'm absolutely not against it. Whatever gets people moving is great. But I think there's something to be said about the self-responsibility piece that I believe was always part of Joseph Pilates' work. It was called The Art of Contrology, right? It was about you making decisions for yourself. It was about you trying your best to go through the sequence with grace and ease and economy and all of that stuff, flow, precision, name it. All of those elements that we love about this work, it wasn't necessarily always about doing it perfectly. And that is something that I really took away from my research and looking at videography from back in the day, where you see Joseph Pilates see somebody go really poorly through a reformer work or a reformer practice, and he doesn't stop them. He doesn't nitpick them. He might take their head and push them to inappropriate places. But that aside, it was mostly about, okay, do it now, fail at it, do it again tomorrow. Hopefully you're a little better at it. And then again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and so forth. And that's how you learn, that's how you become familiar, and that's how you become literate and fluent in the work. And now I'm not sure anymore if I'm answering your question at all, because I feel like I went straight on a tangent and ran with it.
No, I love it. I love it. I'm going to rein you back in, though, because I was about to go on your tangent, and that's going to be a duplicate of one of my questions. It's Mental Health Awareness Week this week, and the theme is kindness. Two questions in that. What are you doing for yourself to give yourself self-kindness at the moment?
I give myself space and time, I think comes to mind immediately. I'm very sympathetic and sensitive to what a lot of us are going through right now in terms of the uncertainty and the workarounds that come with this time, right? Figuring out how to keep our kids schooled, how to keep our clients doing Pilates, how to keep our businesses and overhead somewhat afloat, how to right size our expectations of what's going to happen in the next couple of months. It's a constant pool of anxiety and stress triggers for a lot of people, and myself included. It may not look like that right now, but this is uncertain times for everyone. So I think the gift that I decided very quickly to give myself is to not react out of panic. And that's probably part of my character too. I'm German, go figure. I like to think things through before I put them into action. But I also try to not take my situation too seriously right now, and instead give myself the time and space to sit back and observe without feeling like I need to run and do what everybody else around me is doing right now. And I need to jump on the Zoom train and the live train and the constant broadcasting of ideas, and rather taking myself to the drawing board. That's my happy place. So I feel like that's me being kind to myself, to not make rash decisions right now, and to just kind of take it one day at a time and realize that this is a time where we can get away with imperfection, which to anyone who identifies as a perfectionist or a recovering perfectionist like myself, I think this is a really good time to take a step back and realize what's important to me. How can I set the stage for a great future, even if I have no idea what it's going to look like or when I can attack it? We can actually attack a lot of things right now, and I choose to almost ignore some of the anxieties I have and throw myself right into the mix of what can I do right now that's going to make me feel a little bit better. And a lot of that has nothing to do with Pilates. A lot of that has to do with taking the odd online ballet class or just taking really long walks. Fortunately, I'm in a place where I can take walks without that being an illegal conduct. So I indulge in that as much as I can, and just taking a lot of time to think things through for myself, rather than reacting emotionally.
Yeah, there's. I know Zoe's watching, and I noticed a comment that she'd made the other day saying, "Today I've not done anything to do with Pilates or natural medicine is her other sort of area that she's in, and today I'm doing X, Y, and Z." And it made her feel brilliant, so she did it again the next day. And I think that's the act of kindness, is to actually look outside of what your everyday stuff is and think, I had the same thing today with my own child, and having to explain to him about his own kindness to himself, and he doesn't need to be doing all of this schoolwork. If it's a bit overwhelming, maybe he could just be a kid and go and throw buckets of water with his sister, and that's what they're doing now. So kindness, I think, is really brilliant that we're looking at that mental health wise this week. Some of the comments we had in from people either mention stories, and I'm not going to go into anybody's stories, but as stories where they have not received the best kindness from other people in their Pilates journey, and then ask me a question or ask you a question, or they found their own troubles with their own practice, and there's the question for you. What advice would you give to Pilates teachers either teaching the work or for themselves practicing to adopt kindness into either Pilates or their movement practice?
It's a great question. I've been around in the Pilates industry for a little bit now, but I still feel like a baby in this work, and I still feel baffled sometimes, having come into this industry after it was really well defined already, how much kindness was lacking in certain areas of the community, and how that wasn't necessarily indoctrinated in the industry, and even in the ways that teachers get brought up and brought into this industry. To me personally, I don't understand that there is another way other than really taking to the lessons that Pilates is supposed to teach us, which is be mindful of yourself so that you can be more mindful in the world and in how you communicate with others. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, kumbaya all day long per se. But I think the act of kindness that we extend to ourselves by way of practicing and acknowledging that I'm going to be a lifelong learner in this craft that's called Pilates, to better myself. If that doesn't trickle over into how we then teach our students, in how their students then feel about Pilates, etc., I think we're missing the boat. And I think that Pilates, because it's in very many different aspects, a very serious practice, right? It's a no-nonsense kind of body of work in many ways, which is what we love about it. But at the same time, I think it often gets confused with not allowing the light to slip through the cracks, right? I think I can say that I'm known for being somebody who's not always taking himself 100% seriously in this work and beyond, just because that's not the kind of person I am, but also because I feel like it's my attempt to actively balance out the serious aspects of Pilates and the top-down hierarchical information that happens when you're a teacher and somebody is a student, to always try to bring that to even levels and eye-to-eye levels, just because I feel like then it becomes a two-way street, and you're kind to your client, they're kind to you, and you get to work on something together. And I think that's a very different philosophy to work from than saying, oh, I know much more than you, therefore I get to be unkind.
Yeah.
And that is something that I have experienced just like anybody else in this industry. And it's something that never made it into my DNA because I repel it personally. And I don't think that there needs to be a place for that. I believe that authority and kindness can coexist, and they actually work really nicely with one another. And that's, I think, what I would want to impart on people too. It's always look for how this makes you feel and why you're in this work. There's a reason that must be positive somewhere in there, right? We don't do Pilates or teach Pilates because we hate it or because we had traumatic experiences becoming a teacher, etc. There's something underneath all of that brought us to the work that made us think, oh, I need to share this with other people. Focusing on that helps us reconnect to those around us in a way that is a lot more kind, I believe. Mm-hmm.
And I love Kathy Ross Nash's quote of, forgive me if I'm not saying completely correct, but Pilates isn't constipated. while I take a swig, plus not constipated, it should be fun, right? So I think that
100%.
is something you really come across when people get the chance to work with you. There are jazz hands. It is a playground approach. There is very much, there they are. There is a very much aspect of fun to serious work. It doesn't have to be, this is the way Pilates was. This is how you can playground and explore, and I really think that comes across in your teaching. I'm going to bring you right back now to the kind of beginning of Joe Pilates, because for you have really gone into movement and the history. What was it, your light bulb moment that made you decide to really geek out with the kind of history side of Pilates?
While the insects are attacking me. So.
Oh, really? Well,
I know. So I know that you and many others that are listening will appreciate this. Many of us have at some point or another moved beyond our initial training, right? And sort of bridged one way or another, contemporary to classical, classical to contemporary. I've done both, in fact. Started classical, moved into contemporary, went back to classical at some point. And my main inspiration in digging into the history of this work was that I just felt like I was never really given the answers that I wanted about this work. I had this desire to understand this work on a fundamental, philosophical, and conceptual level. And so I, started where a lot of us start, by seeking out first generation teachers, people that were in contact with Joseph Pilates, that were at the original studio. And even then, like, the closer I got to the source, the more I realized I'm not going to get my answers here either, because I think people will share with you what Joseph Pilates taught them. But what I was interested in was, what did this guy do? What did he have in mind? What did he want to give to the world? Not just to you specifically, but how did he put this work together, and how did he present it to you before he knew who you were? So that was the big question that was looming over me, especially when I started becoming a teacher trainer, and sort of being responsible for apprentices and their questions. And at that point, I think there was a turn in how new, younger teachers come into the work. They don't come into the work because they heard about this underground movement anymore. Those days are over. People come into Pilates knowing it's a fully fleshed out workout system, fitness system. They come in from all walks of life, not just because they were, dancers who were in the right place at the right time and they heard about this thing called Pilates. There was a whole different crowd coming into this industry wanting to be certified. And the questions they brought, I think, were ones that were never asked before up until that point. So I, as a teacher trainer, felt like it's in my responsibility to have better answers for them. And I wasn't getting them anywhere. And I was like, okay, you know what? I have to skip the second and the first generation for a second and go right to the source. The first thing I realized, well, let me start by reading the books. And after reading the books, as we all have done millions of times, I was like, well, this guy is so outspoken, there must be more where this came from. So one thing led to another, and there were many different things that suddenly really brought up other light bulb moments, like my German grandfather, my now late grandfather, peeking over my shoulder at some point while I was studying Pilates manuals in both German and English so that I could teach in German, because even though it's my native tongue, I didn't learn Pilates in German. It's a whole thing. Anywho, he peeks over my shoulder looking at these exercises, and he realized that those are exercises that he did as a kid. Those were part of, his gym class, if you will, back in the early 1900s. And a light bulb went off. Like, oh, this work actually did come from somewhere. It didn't just become invented at some point out of nowhere. No thunderbolt struck Joseph Pilates, and all of a sudden he had this method in mind. It came from something that he grew up with as well. The fact that Joseph Pilates lived in the German town of Gelsenkirchen for a really long time, which is my hometown. Like, there were all of these things that I suddenly realized, which only made me obsess about this person more. But the questions that I always sought to answer were very little about his personal life and what I call the soap opera of Joseph Pilates. It would make an excellent soap opera, by the way. But, the pieces that are relevant to, questions like the one you led in with, why was it called the Universal Reformer? Why the sequence on the mat? How did the mat come about? Which was first, the mat or the reformer? Those things were relevant to me because that helped me create a better understanding of how Pilates was constructed, so that I could then convey it to the next generation of teachers who had these very brilliant questions that I just didn't have a good enough answer to.
And I think when now Joe Pilates isn't around, it's not like you can get that far back to the source, and you get that Chinese whispers effect. And that's kind of where I want to bring you on to a bit, because there are so many stories. We don't really know whether things are the legend, the myth. I remember once in the workshop you sort of saying that Mr. Joe Pilates himself was a good PR man. You're never going to spin your own bad story. So we don't know really how much of this is true, how much was Joe's spin on it, how much was made up by other people. But I'm going to hit you with kind of snippets, and I want you to tell us as much as you know of, do you think it was fact, or is it, let's say not a lie, but let's say a little white lie or a little PR spin? So the first one is taking Joe kind of back to when he was young. The reports are that he lost the sight of his left eye from some bullies sitting on him and throwing stones at him. Any thoughts on that?
This will be my answer for a lot of the questions that will come up around Joseph Pilates. And you've hinted at it, but I just want to make it clear. There is the factual biographical timeline where we can say with great clarity, this is where he was at this time, this is where he went next, this is when he opened a boxing studio, this is when he immigrated to the United States, this is when he became a citizen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is when the Cadillac finally came to fruition, and all of those things. And then there's a lot of stuff that's unknowable. And then, as a third piece to that, there is this is what Joseph Pilates wanted us to know about him. And that's where we tap into the PR guy, right? The concept that he, social media wasn't around. There was no YouTube at the time. So he had to figure out other ways to make himself known, exuberant, and remembered by those he came in contact with. And I think with that came a long line of stories that maybe started off as a white, harmless lie, and they made it into our Pilates narrative now to, to the place where I can, if you look at 5 Pilates websites, 4 of them will tell you the story of the hospital beds during World War I and how they magically became a Cadillac. That's not necessarily wrong, because that's what Joseph Pilates wanted you to know, but it's not factually true. So we kind of have to pull all of that apart a little bit. Now, when it comes to his eyesight, we know that he had a glass eye, and it is likely that he lost his eye as a child. There are other rumors that I've heard that he maybe have lost his eye during a boxing accident, because he was very heavily involved in boxing. And I could argue with that it probably makes sense to not go into the boxing profession if you only have one eye to begin with. But that aside, his story was that he was bullied as a child because of his last name, and other kids calling him Pontius Pilate, murderer of Christ, etc. in this very Catholic town of Mönchengladbach that he grew up in. So that's the story that he told. Whether it's factual or not, I don't even want to say, but chances are that he managed to make that a story that is probably more sensational than what happened in real life.
I think, for the purposes of this, people are so interested to hear from you. Is there any more padding that you can throw light to? So again, another one, he was a sickly child, but he, by the time of 14, became a model posing for anatomical charts.
Yeah. Again, we don't know any of that for sure. But he has an interesting spin on this whole thing, because the story that he posed for anatomical charts, coincides with the drawings that he had at his studio, right? Right around the mid-50s, these posters popped up in his studio, these big, large pencil drawings that we see in a lot of pictures from the original studio, where you see sort of a man crouching over to one side from the back, and you see a close-up of a leg. There's a picture of the circulatory system. And from what I understand, he told people that he posed for those pictures. And, you know, how would he know that one day in the future, someone's going to figure him out and realize that those pictures are actually from a book? I was told this actually. The person who led me on to this was Bob Leekins, the late Bob Leekins, great Bob Leekins. The book that those drawings stem from is called, let me see if I can get this right, Anatomy for Art Students, or the Handbook of Anatomy for Art Students by Arthur Thompson. And it has all of those drawings in it. Now, the book was released when Joseph Pilates was about 14 years old, but next to the drawings are also photographs of the person that stood model for the pictures, and we can very clearly see it's not Joseph Pilates. So what I can tell you with certainty is that those drawings that are still being sold as, you know, the posters that Joseph Pilates stood model for are not Joseph Pilates. That's a fact. Whether he actually modeled for drawings elsewhere, I don't know.
Yeah.
My hint is almost that he claimed that for himself a little bit, but we don't know. We don't know. It might very well be true that he was that fit by that point in time, that he was that interested in body work and bodybuilding, that was possible. The, you know, sickly child quote that a lot of us know directly conflicts with the, you know, never sick a day, never took an aspirin in my life. So which is which? You know, like I think Joseph Pilates was not concerned about fact checking as much as making a point when it came to professing the efficacy of his work. And I believe that sickness may well have run in his family. We know that one of his siblings died at a very young age. His mother passed away before he reached the age of 10, if I'm not mistaken. Those facts sometimes elude me because I don't practice them often enough, because I'm not that interested in this, the soap opera, as I've mentioned before. But I believe that those very likely hint at events in his life, but may not always represent the factual truth.
Yeah. There's a lot of conversation around his name, which you mentioned about, you know, there's the conversation of him being bullied. Obviously, even still today, people either say Pilates, as in a cup of tea, or Pilates, as in a latte, cup of coffee. But I read that his niece said actually the name was Pilots. And then, of course, there's the story that he was from Greek origin, and that apparently he lived in Greece, moved to Germany, and then changed his name. How do you pronounce it?
It depends on where I am. You know, if I'm in the United States, it's Pilates. I think in Europe, it's mostly Pilates. Pilates. I can't even say it. And I think if I read it as a German last name, I would read it Pilates. And if I take Pilates and pronounce it in an American fashion, it could very much sound like Pilates, right? So what we do know, and you know, those of you who are really interested in this, there's a book, I think just called Hubertus Joseph Pilates, the biography by Javier Perez Pont, who really went down the rabbit hole of researching the genealogy of Joseph Pilates. He goes way, way back in time to the great, 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 great grandfather of the priest who married Joseph Pilates' great, 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 great grandmother, yada. He goes really, really granular and deep with it. And based on his research, it's clear that Joseph Pilates was as German as they come. There was maybe some Dutch in the bloodline, but definitely no Greek. Again, I think Joseph Pilates was so enamored with, you know, Greek philosophies, the Greek ideas around bodybuilding, you know, sane mind, sane body, those ideas that I think he adopted the fact that Pilates could well be a Greek-ish sounding name to adopt that as part of his narrative. But he was as German as they come.
Do you know if he had an abdominal separation? There's the big reports of him having the big barrel chest. Is that to do with smoking? Some people have said it's to do with abdominal separation from having a lot of weightlifting. Any facts or tidbits of information you found across that?
I've never even heard that before. I've heard people talk about his, you know, very voluminous ribcage. And my take on that was always that I felt that the modern Pilates teacher always wanted to find an excuse for his ribs to be that distended, because we Pilates teachers don't like that. But I do think that it's symptomatic of the emphysema that he ultimately died of. But I think it was just also his body type and the way that he carried himself around, right? He was known for throwing his chest out and walking around in a fashion that made you stand up straighter when you saw him, or that made you notice him, because he was also not, the tallest guy on the planet. I think he came in at around 5'8". I don't know what that translates to in centimeters anymore. So I've never heard of the abdominal separation theory. But I'm also not surprised that that's in the mix.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps they didn't know what that was, and perhaps they do. We will never really know. So he moved to England in 1912. I'm very interested in the number of women that float around. He's quite a womanizer, wasn't he? There was the first wife, and then there seemed to be no mention of her ever moving to England and the daughter. Then there was another wife, and then she didn't die too much later. But then there was Clara. Womanizer. That's something that doesn't often get mentioned.
One wife mysteriously died along the way. I'm telling you, if this ever gets made into a soap opera, I'll binge watch it. The story with Clara is really fascinating because there's some geographical overlap that may well have happened in the 2-3 years leading up to his departure to New York. But again, this is so unknowable that all we can do is try and piece it together from oral history, which we now know we can't fully trust, as well as just kind of looking at, how he later on interacted with his child, with, his daughter who came to the United States, and his mystery visit back to Germany. There's so many stories around that it's very hard to unscramble the egg and figure out what's true, what's not. There's lots of assumptions being made, but what is clear is that this man was a womanizer in many ways, and that he took pride in that fact, and that his wife or his partner in life, Clara, was privy to that as well. It was not a secret thing that he was, as Ted Shawn said in his biography, philandering at Jacob's Pillow with the young dancers. There are many different accounts that would very much remind us of, the recent and current Me Too movement, where, we just kind of have to look at his time, not with an air of making excuses for him or defending him, but he definitely was living in a time where he felt like he wasn't being inappropriate by living out his manlyhood, whatever that meant to him. And we can only assume what it meant to him, but he was definitely a ladies' man.
And different times, because he also smoked cigars quite famously during teaching as well, didn't he? And that was quite a normal thing really to do back then. People smoked all the time whilst, being a medical professional. So it now perhaps seems strange of these things, but perhaps back then it was quite normal for him to be having a cigar whilst teaching Pilates.
I think a lot of things that happened back in the original studio would seem very strange to us. I think our Pilates sessions end on, a wall exercise, maybe a scented towel. I don't know. Maybe a little like, oh, you're coming up on your package. You need to buy 10 more sessions, which, back in the day, like you would get a good old scrub from the guy if you were lucky, right? You were pushed in a cold shower, plastic curtain, and given a brush to dry off your skin. And that was part of Pilates as much as the exercises. And I think to us, all of that stuff seems really weird and strange, but that's ultimately what we talk about when we talk about, authentic Pilates. It wasn't just doing your 100 and roll up and roll over. It was also all the other stuff.
So we've got a lot of that kind of information in Your Health, that there is so much more to Pilates as in the man other than the exercises. And, there is all the furniture. There is, like you say, there's dry skin brushing. He's very big on the hygiene and fresh air. Do you know what the kind of accounts are that we can believe as what was the first experience like to go to Joe's studio? What did you start with? You see Joe, you have some private sessions. What was your next part moving on into the sort of gymnasium?
Yeah, obviously game of telephone, but my understanding is, and the way that I sort of paraphrase it, is that you enter sort of a binary when you come to the original studio for your first time, where either you're deemed ready to move into the practice of contrology, which means you're fairly quickly entering a self-practice with the work, or you had to be taken care of individually because of issues, conditions, things that we might call pre-Pilates, which is what I think a lot of contemporary Pilates was born out of. You were taken to a different section of the studio and you would need private attention in order to be given corrective work. If you don't hit that curve on the binary and you were good to go, you would basically from day one start entering the practice as in this is yours to learn. This is yours to practice. You commit to coming in 3 times a week for a minimum of 3 months. If you're not willing to commit to that, come back when you're ready. And there was this very clear entry point into this is what it's going to take for you to understand what this can do for you, right? There wasn't there were trial lessons, if I understand correctly, from some of his brochures, but it wasn't nearly as delicate as today to convince somebody to enter the practice. You kind of had to make that decision before even lying down on a reformer for the first time, so that by the time you are doing footwork for the first time, you already made that commitment to yourself, and you have not just 1 or 2 or 3 sessions to make up your mind, but the course of 3 months to see how much you've grown. And in a way, that's a quite brilliant sales tool, probably one that wouldn't work today anymore. And from what I understand, it didn't work too well for him either. But that was the clarity that he brought to his work, understanding in order for you to understand what this does for you, you can't just take the odd class here and there. You need to commit to learning the basics of this work. And this is how long it's going to take. This is how much you have to muscle up for it, literally and proverbially. And that's really inspiring to this day for me to kind of look at his understanding that Pilates isn't something that you necessarily appreciate within a second. The depth of what there is to appreciate about Pilates unfolds over a longer stretch of time. So how do you make space for that? He did that by just demanding it right off the gate, which I think is cool. And again, I don't know what question of yours I'm answering right now anymore.
It's great.
What the session was like. I think, after you've had your intake, I believe you basically just showed up whenever it pleased you. I don't think that people had, the 7 a.m. on Wednesdays per se, unless that's what it needed to be for them. But it was very much like having a gym membership, right? You pay as you go. You drop your $5 or whatever it was in the piggy bank. You grab your little Speedo, get changed, put your slippers on, grab a towel, put it on the equipment, and you get going. And you look at wall charts, taking yourself through the work. And there were floor trainers walking around, giving you advice, giving you hands-on and encouragement, or selecting a new exercise for you to try somewhere else, or helping you along the way. But there wasn't this, I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but there wasn't this idea of babysitting a client through every single second of their session, as is very common today. Coddling, perhaps, is a better word. And again, this is also, I think, rooted in the philosophy of his work, where he was very clear that if you don't make that commitment to yourself, and if you don't bring the willpower to teach yourself these skills that we're trying to impart on you, you're not really learning anything here. We're not going to spoon feed you, your 100 and your short spine over and over again. At some point, you just have to know it. And again, it was in that regard. And that's something I'm trying to wrap my head around now. And this kind of goes back to your group reformer class question. I think a lot of us think of Pilates and the original Pilates studio as the forefather of boutique fitness, right? The idea that you would go to a studio that is dedicated to a specific type of workout, per se. I don't think that's true. I think that the original Pilates studio was the forefather of the gym as we know it. It had its own philosophy, but you didn't just do one type of exercise in there. You did everything from remedial to corrective to highly athletic work in the Pilates studio. It was a movement language that had an A and a Z and all the letters in between. And no, not everybody had to do all of those things. You practiced, just like when you have your gym membership, not everybody does the treadmill and the Stairmaster and the weights and the kettlebells and the this and the that. You pick and choose what's right for you, and somebody guides you through the process and gives you an idea of, like, you should be really working on this. You should be working on your cardio, your stamina, your strength, your power, what have you. I think Pilates was set up that same way. So in a way, it was a gymnasium. It was a gym. with floor trainers. It wasn't a school with personal instruction all the time, because again, he hammered the apparatus together so that teaches you, if that makes sense.
And did he create the apparatus, or was it Fred, or a mixture?
The apparatus. I think it was a healthy mix. A lot of the original pieces carry Fred Pilates' name. At some point, there was a geographical separation between the two, where it's very likely that Joseph Pilates carried the work on his own. We know that he had a workshop upstate Massachusetts, near the Jacob's Pillow side, where he tinkered with apparatus. We also know that Fred Pilates came to visit him there and worked with him there. We have videos of him practicing on the apparatus in Massachusetts. So I think there was a considerable amount of overlap, but at least to my knowledge and to what I had access to when doing my research, I haven't found a lot of communication between the two to, really give you a factual answer to that. But I do know that there's a considerable amount of overlap.
So the name Contrology, there are reports that didn't really catch on. It wasn't very catchy, and it changed to Pilates. And then there's reports that it changed Pilates after he died. Where's your take on the name?
Yeah, so we see in some of the, what I call the marketing brochures, right? Joseph Pilates was pretty prolific in putting together very stimulating visuals to promote his work, right? He was by far not the only person running a place, a local business for movement practice or strength or bodybuilding practice, but he had a very distinct graphic style. If you think about the around the clock or around the world graphic that he put together, the clock image, his knack for how he decorated the studio, the anatomy drawings, the statues of him everywhere, right? These Greek looking poses that he photographed himself in, etc. He had a very, very strong visual style. In some of those brochures, we see that he used Pilates method or the Pilates gymnasium. Like, he didn't just refer to it as Contrology, as is often assumed. So I think at some point, even during his lifetime, Contrology and Pilates became synonymous, especially during the 50s when, he became a lot more, not that he became a lot more outspoken, but he was a lot more publicly visible, because at some point he after being on the faculty for Jacob's Pillow for a few years, he basically used the publicist of Ted Shawn, the founder of Jacob's Pillow and the dance festival. The publicist, her name is Fern Helcher, she really got him featured in all the newspapers, in magazines. She got him on TV and all of those things. So around the 50s, we see the surge of places where he gets mentioned in the public media. And I think as his image became more familiar and known to people, he started adopting the name Pilates more regularly as well. And we hear him talk about Contrology a little bit less. But that's just an observation.
I like the name of the Pilates Gymnasium. It's going back to, as you were saying before, that I think now Pilates has become very much, you teach, the teacher teaches, the people wait for the teacher to instruct them. And then you've got the other kind of side of Pilates now that has the semi-private aspect, where people do have to be more accountable for themselves. There's not many places that do teach semi-privately. There's not many instructors that learn that kind of way in their training, because it is quite a hard skill to learn. And more people don't necessarily want to adopt their own understanding for themselves and responsibility. They finish work, they want to just be led and taught. But going kind of back to the gymnasium, that's really what it was about, right? Was for him to let you explore your work, not drip feed everything to you.
100%. And I think the fact that, we now look at this open gym model, which I know as an educator, it's a question I get a lot, right? Around the concept of the original business model. How can we adopt that? And I think right now actually is a really great opportunity to start thinking about that in terms of what it would enable us to do and offer the world in terms of Pilates, in terms of democratizing Pilates, in terms of, dealing with whatever rules and regulations are going to be thrown at us as Pilates people, when things go back to whatever the next normal is going to be. But over the last 10 years, I think my observation always was wherever the open gym model was offered, it often failed because the culture and the expectations of the clients were always, but then I don't know if I'm doing it right? Because out of 55 minutes with you, for 53 minutes, you tell me what I'm doing wrong, right? So I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where we've created a culture where clients believe that if they don't do Pilates perfectly, they're wasting their time. And I think in the original sense, the Pilates practice was about you sucking at it for 20 years until you start getting a little better at it. And that was okay. I think we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. I think once Pilates got scooped up by the rise of the fitness industry, and then it overtook Pilates and took Pilates along for the ride, I think the expectation and the philosophy around how Pilates should be practiced and delivered has changed drastically. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, because otherwise you and I probably wouldn't be doing this right now. We probably wouldn't know what Pilates is. And I don't know, a dentist. I have no idea what I would be. Probably not a dentist, actually.
I'd like to be I'd like to work in maternity hospital and bring life for babies. I think that's what I would do, is my other side.
I love that. But here we are. So I think it's a great opportunity to kind of rethink that a little bit. Now that we have, our business models are thrown out the window right now, right? Our only outlet is Zoom and this and any kind of, visual media to connect ourselves with our students. And I feel like what's happening right now is that our students have to become more self-responsible in their practice as a result. So I think part of me is actually really excited for the future of Pilates, because I think we can reconnect to some core values, no pun intended, of Contrology and the Pilates method in ways that can be really beneficial for the longevity of this work. So that's my preach moment.
Yeah, the kindness again, because not everything is going to fit the same way for each person. Every key is not going to fit the keyhole, and it's about bringing the kindness into yourself on the day that you practice Pilates and the body you have, and whether you've slept funny and whether you've been running the day before and got a tight hip. It might feel differently. You might have to work differently and kind of adapt that and adopt that kindness to yourself and to if you're teaching, that it doesn't have to be, this is the way. It's coming. So where does the stand to sit come in? Because that's what people are quite interested in. I find this personally very fascinating because there's not much around about the stand to sit. And I know there's something that I've done with you in a workshop of, it's so functional. And we've seen it on, I can't remember what the test, there was a TV program that had Angela Rippon or somebody doing a test of how healthy are you, when are you going to die? That's this kind of thing. Is if you stay working without your hands to get up and out of a chair, you're probably going to lead a long and healthy life. Where does the stand to sit come into the Pilates method?
Yeah, I think it was probably about 5 years ago when this research was published by a Brazilian doctor. I'm going to butcher his name, so I'm not even going to try it, but people will Google for sit to stand test and you'll find all the details. But that research revealed that especially in the elderly population, the ability to get to the ground and back up to standing without the help of your hands is a predictor of longevity. Right. And you can become more granular on what that means and the implications of it. And because it was all, it was super on trend to post that research and get nerdy about it. And I was immediately thinking, well, that's exactly how we get to the mat in the beginning of our, classical mat practice. We cross our arms, we cross our feet, and we lower ourselves down without using our hands or our knees. The part I was always missing was like, but why don't we stand back up? Right. And so I don't know that Pilates was necessarily keeping that in mind, but if we look at Pilates as a movement practice that was meant to teach you to be in control of your body for as long as you live, with this understanding that since you have a human body, you're responsible for it, right? That was sort of the original premise. And it didn't matter what your human body looked like. If you had one, you had to take care of it. That's pretty much the original premise of Pilates, right? And here's a method that helps you take care of it. Everything that we do in Pilates, all the obscure things, think crab, right? Like rolling over your crossed knees, going up front, all these loaded exercises that we do, they all do relate back to the kind of coordination, timing, strength, balance, etc. Like all of those things that are part of the sit to stand requirement as far as the skill set goes are reflected in the Pilates method. So if you even just run through the mat exercises and consider, the compression you give your hip and knee when you do your one leg stretch, etc., like all of those skills combined should enable you to get back up to standing. So a few years ago, I started doing that in workshops where I was like, okay, so we've all been practicing going down for all of our Pilates lives. Let's try to go back up. And lo and behold, that's the hardest thing for a lot of us even, because it's a skill that we don't practice. So it just was another light bulb for me where I realized the functional carryover of what this practice is meant to do has to translate into real life skill. And if not, then yeah, you have a beautiful teaser, but so what? Right?
Yeah.
If that actually doesn't help you get to standing up, get out of a chair. I'm blessed to have my 5-year-old nephew visit us this week, and he loves being thrown around the pool. Thankfully, I can still lift my arms overhead and throw a toddler around. I don't recommend that, by the way. Do not try this at home. But point being, like, if the level of strength and coordination that we work on in Pilates does not translate to something real, then we're missing the point. This is not about getting good at Pilates. There's, in fact, no such thing. Going back to everything we talked about, I think Pilates is done right when you're not good at it yet.
Yeah. So can you show us, Benjamin, I know you talk about getting down to get up, but can you show us if you were starting at the beginning of your mat? There is little kind of stuff that I can see about. I've seen people cross the front leg over at a slight jaunty angle. Some people take the back foot and lift it up. How do you find the best way is to sit down? How do we stand to sit for the first part of your mat?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, obviously, when we look at things like, these skills that are really difficult for a lot of people, we can either go at it by saying like, well, you should be able to do this, so let's just do it. But we also have to take into account that we need to modify it one way or another, right? So a lot of how I address this in Pilates is by offering workarounds before going into the real thing. But because I think we're running out of time, I'm just going to show you how I like to link this into our Pilates practice, because I believe that the momentum that we need to come back up to standing comes right out of the work. So let me see if I can rig this up in a way that you can see my mat back there. I hope this is going to work. I did not stage manage this, but can you see me and hear me?
I can see you. You look like you're going to fall off the wall over there. Be careful.
No, I'm good. So I think the way that most of us would practice this in a classical Pilates practice is to cross one foot behind the other, exert pressure against the ground so that it can actually work almost like the speed brake as we lower ourselves down. This is the part that's hard, to roll back over our feet. Think of crab, think of seal, to come back up. Think of going up front, think of your mountain climber, right? One thing that I like to do in my work and in my classes is to link the coming down into hold, which is where we do our 100, and use the strength that you build in this position, wind it up, and let that momentum carry you through into standing back up. I find more often than not, unless you have structural knee and ankle issues, that the core strength you build and this whole body engagement that you build up here serves you in finding the coordination that pulls all the pieces back together as you come back up to standing, which is really the part that we often skip. And I think it's an excellent warm-up exercise for our mat classes, especially now that all we have is the mat for many of us.
And I think most people would call that effortless effort, which you just demonstrated there, where all of us would be thinking, oh my God, that's so hard. And you made it look effortless in your effort. So I think we'll leave it.
Just so you know.
I think we'll leave it before we get cut off. I'm so grateful. Thank you. And thank you for everybody for your time and sending in questions. They were literally
so lovely.
So thank you, Benjamin, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your 40-degree heat. Time for a lollipop.
Thank you.